So in this session, they were giving peer feedback on a poster activity that they'd been doing in teams. Before this session, they'd spent 4 weeks working in the lab with me in groups to solve a biochemical research problem. And they then had to make a poster to summarise their work in the lab. And during the session, I got them to pass those drafts round to other groups and add feedback, positive and negative things, using post-it notes. And then eventually they got their own poster back again, covered in feedback notes. My role in this session was really just to go around and facilitate the discussions. So I like to sit for a few minutes with each group and talk through the feedback they were giving and maybe help facilitate those discussions, trying not to give the answers, but just to perhaps ask open questions to point out anything that they might have missed. So I like to ask questions such as, is there anything missing from this section? Or how could you maybe improve the layout of this section? Are there too many words in this section? That kind of thing, without trying to give them the answers. So really just facilitating the discussions.
I think it was fun and inspiring sort of seeing other people's work and what other people had made. And also like the academics walking around, having an opportunity to talk about them.
So in terms of resources, I often like to use quite a lot of technology-enhanced learning. So I use a lot of Mentimeter and Padlet and point solutions and so on. But for this activity, I actually chose to go really low-tech. And I just printed out the draft posters in A3. And I got the students to actually put post-it notes on. And I think sometimes actually going low-tech helps the students to really get stuck in and engages them in more active conversations rather than them all staring at a screen. I think there's a lot of benefits that can be had from peer feedback, although it's not always a popular thing to do with students. I think it is good to try to get them to do it. It allows them to engage with the marking criteria. So if nothing else, it gets them to look at the marking criteria and get to know it to improve their assessment literacy. But it also allows them to develop their critical ability, really. It helps them to start thinking critically about pieces of work, looking at examples of what works well, what works less well, and then hopefully they can then apply that critical ability when they get their own work back again.
I think discussing ideas and like being able to vocalise your own ideas is quite important. So it was good practising that.
Critical analysis mainly, and being sort of creative with feedback you gave, just so you weren't doing the same feedback that other people had already said.
I guess it's kind of challenging to critique other people's work because, you feel a bit insecure about yours, but you gotta think of something to say and critique about others' ideas, and also maybe analyzing how they did their own stuff compared to our own.
I think this activity works really well in groups. In this case, they did the whole project in a group and they knew their group cohort really well. But it really helps to get them engaged in active conversations and discussions about it, which I think helps them learn from each other. So they're kind of constructing their knowledge together as a group, helping to perhaps pick up anything that somebody else missed, as well as obviously developing team working skills, which are also very helpful in many different careers.
Everyone had their own kind of interpretation of the task. So it was nice seeing other people's ideas and getting to discuss them with a group.
Even if you don't agree with what they say or what they think, it's interesting to hear other people's perspectives.
This room in particular, Ivy Gate, actually works really well, I think, for this type of activity. The classroom is obviously a flatbed space rather than a tiered lecture theatre. The teacher can easily walk around between the tables and engage with the students. I particularly like the fact that in this space there's also a screen at every table, which allows you to put up some information whilst the students are working. And in this case, I put up the marking criteria, so they had that there for reference as they were peer reviewing each other's work. Well, at the end of the session, they obviously get their own poster back, hopefully covered in lots of helpful feedback, post-it notes with what works well and what can be improved. They can take away the poster and all the post-it notes.
And I think a good skill that we learned in this session is trying to process all these feedbacks and implement it in our own posters. So yeah, I think that's really helpful.
So they had about a week after the peer feedback session before the final deadline. And I hope they will then spend some time working as a group, reflecting on that peer feedback and thinking of what they might change before they submit the final thing. In the final year of their degree, they again have to do various poster activities. So hopefully a lot of the skills will be directly applicable to what they do in the following year. It's also a very authentic exercise because making posters about a research project is a very authentic thing that scientists do. Of course, we appreciate that not all our students do go on and become researchers, but obviously group work is a really important transferable skill for all students in virtually all careers. Peer appraisal and self-appraisal indeed is really important in a variety of different careers, that ability to critically engage with a piece of work and give helpful feedback. I think a challenge for teachers with active learning is that it can be quite unpredictable. Unlike giving a didactic lecture where you know what's going to happen, you can't always predict how students are going to respond and how they're going to engage with the activity. So I think you need to be quite prepared to be flexible about the timings and how you run the session. There are often some students who struggle with peer-to-peer interactions or are less familiar with this type of active learning where they actually are expected to speak up. And there's a number of ways you can help support that. We find that it's often helpful for students to know in advance that they're going to be required to speak up so they can prepare themselves. And perhaps you can find some alternative ways for them to contribute, for example, in written form rather than in spoken form if they're struggling to actually speak up. In this particular session, obviously, we were asking students to write post-it notes, but also I think students are often more willing to say things in written form than in verbal form. It's often hard to give feedback and indeed to receive feedback, especially when it's perhaps negative feedback. We do obviously encourage them to be polite and kind and constructive with their feedback. They can use that written form to be honest but helpful to each other, where they might struggle more if it was just a verbal feedback. I think the main advice would really be just be brave and give it a go and accept the fact that not everything you do might work, but you can hopefully learn from that going forward and have things work better a second time. But I think there are a lot of advantages, so I would definitely advise people to give it a go, because I think the potential learning gains for the students are huge, and it can be a really fun and creative way to make a really nice environment in the class.